Good morning. My name is Mark Baldessari, and I am President and CEO of the Public Policy Institute of California. Thank you for joining us today. PPIC is pleased to present this virtual program on the 2020 election and the implications for California and the nation. This event is part of the PPIC Speaker Series on California's future. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support any positions on any ballot measures, legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for office. And the views of our event speakers do not necessarily reflect the views of the Public Policy Institute of California. We'd like to thank the sponsors of this series for their underwriting support. These organizations are listed on your screen and on our website. This series is also funded by the PPIC Donor Circle and the PPIC Corporate Circle, groups of individuals and organizations that provide generous support to PPIC. Please consider joining us as a sponsor or donor so that we may continue to make programs like today's possible. Before we begin, if you have a question for our panelists, and I hope you do, please send an email to the email address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. We'd appreciate you including your name and organization along with the question. First, we'd like to offer some context from key findings in the latest PPIC statewide survey as we reflect on the state and national election landscape. California's likely voters are anxious about the troubling state of affairs in the nation and the state, including COVID-19, the economy, racial injustice, and a record wildfire season. The recent news about the president further raises the stature of COVID-19 in this election. Democrats and Republicans are worlds apart about the path to a brighter future. As we enter the final stretch of the 2020 election, 57% of likely voters in California are pessimistic and 41% are optimistic that Americans of different political views can still come together and work out their differences. In a rare instance of partisan agreement, majorities of Democrats, Republicans, and independents today are pessimistic. These are powerful forces at work with profound consequences for the 2020 election and beyond. I'd like to turn things over to our distinguished moderator. Carla Marinucci is a senior writer for Politico's California Playbook and one of the state's leading political writers and digital influencers. Carla has covered 6 presidential elections and 7 California gubernatorial elections. Carla, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Mark. I'm so excited to be with you all and the opportunity to talk about this election like no other with this panel of top political journalists. Let me introduce who we've got on board today. Perry Bacon Jr., senior political writer for FiveThirtyEight.com. Priya David Clemens, host of the KQED Newsroom. Tamara Keith, White House correspondent for National Public Radio, and Jennifer Medina, national politics reporter for the New York Times. Such a great panel, so much to talk about. We really thank PPIC and the sponsors also for making this possible. Let's get started. I want you all to kind of set the table briefly to just give us a sense of your key takeaway right now in terms of the landscape of the election 2020, what it says about our national and state political landscape today. Perry, let me start with you. Just give us briefly your rundown here.
So I mean, the big rundown is Trump started off, won in a very narrow way, kind of like lost the popular vote, and his approval ratings have stayed pretty similar no matter what has happened. Like, you know, our average of the polls of individuals' approval rating showed Trump was at 42% in February. This is before COVID. Most people had ever heard of COVID before. And now he's around 43% right now, considering everything that's happened. That was before he was impeached, before COVID, before the economy collapsed in some ways as well, which tells me that we have a fairly stable, set, and very divided electorate.
Priya, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, let me look at it a little bit more from the state perspective from California, right, where we are overwhelmingly Democratic, where there's been not a single Republican elected to statewide office since 2006. And I'd say from the Democratic perspective here, in the immortal words of campaign reporter Hunter S. Thompson, there is fear and loathing. Loathing for President Trump and his actions in office, and true fear that 2016 could repeat itself. Now, I will say in some of the more Democratic enclaves, certainly in the Bay Area, there's an incredulity. I thought that no, couldn't possibly happen again. And yet that's not where the polls bear out. Obviously, California, you know, as Perry was just mentioning, that popular vote that Hillary Clinton won, well, she won that popular vote here in California. All of those votes went to her here in California. So for the Democratic side, a lot of fear and loathing, which is really pushing up the campaign donations. So in the state, an LA Times report noted that Joe Biden had raised about 100 million, a little bit more than that. And Trump, however, had still raised about 60 million here. And this is due to the fact that conservatives in the state are still super energized. And California, of course, is an ATM.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, Tamara Keith, well known to Sacramento, but now in Washington. Give us your thoughts.
So I think my big thought is that 2020 is not 2016. There are some really big differences. There's a lot of PTSD about 2016 that I think all of us have some element of, and certainly particularly Democratic voters have a big element of it. But there are a lot of really big differences between 2016 and 2020, which include things like President Trump is not an unknown quantity where you could just be like, well, let's take a chance on this guy. Who knows? Like, we've had enough of Washington. Let's see what this guy does. Voters know what he does. And as Perry said, they're pretty locked in. Like, there aren't a lot of people who don't have opinions about him. Which interestingly is where Hillary Clinton was 4 years ago. There were virtually no people who had no opinion on Hillary Clinton. People had, many of them, intensely negative views of Hillary Clinton that were either hatched in the 90s or hatched in the 70s when she didn't initially change her name after she married Bill Clinton. There was this whole apparatus built up for like a generation around demonizing Hillary Clinton. Joe Biden does not excite the same passion. Now, he, generally speaking, also does not excite the same passion. You know, there aren't people running around in aviators like there were women running around in pantsuits excited about Hillary Clinton. But he doesn't need to excite a lot of passion because the passion is so strong about President Trump. So, I mean, obviously, like, things can still change because, you know, a week ago, 5 days ago, we were going to talk all about the debate. And now the president has COVID. So like, you don't know what to expect. There's 20 more days, but also like 3 million people or whatever have already voted. So it's just completely different.
Amazing. Jenny, your thoughts?
I want to go with all of the above, all these things that Perry and Priya and Tamara just mentioned. This, on the one hand, is the most divided I certainly have ever seen the country in my lifetime. When I go out to talking to voters, this was true pre-COVID, and I think even more true post-COVID. People are just so entrenched of their views, and not just their political views, but their real views of reality. You know, I spent some time, I was in Phoenix last week when the news of the president's diagnosis broke, and people see that through completely partisan lens, just basic health and science questions. And I think we sort of underestimate that, or at least I often underestimate that living in California where it is so overwhelmingly Democratic. And the other thing, just to underscore what Perry said, is how much nothing has changed on the other hand. Like, on the one hand, news is constantly changing every few minutes, and the polls have been remarkably consistent throughout.
Yeah, that's just been an amazing aspect of this. Let me just remind the viewers that you can submit your questions to this great panel at PPIC eventquestions@gmail.com. We'll be taking those. As you mentioned, Tamara, the script on this whole event has just been thrown out over the last couple of days with the president's COVID diagnosis. You were at Walter Reed yesterday. Tell us about that. What is the mood there among the press corps, and you know, I mean, I want to ask all of you in terms of what do you think the biggest impact of this development is on the election? Let's start with you, Tamara.
Yeah, so let me just tell you what I was doing yesterday. As most people watching this know, there is a pool of reporters who go wherever the president goes. So when the president is in the hospital, 13 of us sit outside of the hospital all day long, waiting for the president, waiting for the president's doctors. So I think that it's like the most important part of the job that we do. It's a solemn obligation, even if that means being, taken as part of the pool on Air Force One, or normally that's like a good thing, but recently not so much. Or being taken to a campaign rally where no one's wearing masks, or whatever it is our responsibility to be there. And so yesterday that meant that when the president's doctor came out and held this press conference where he was once again evasive about pretty critical things like the scans of the president's lungs, I was there to use my lungs to tell him that, or to ask him, are you purposely not telling us what's going on with the president's lungs? Because that's what it seems like what you're doing. And then he had to say, yep, exactly, not telling you. It ended up being a more eventful day than I was expecting. I thought we would just have like a briefing and then we'd go back to the White House and, done. But instead, we ended up being right there as the president walked out of the hospital, got in a SUV, rode 500 yards, walked up to Marine One and flew off. And so it was sort of a remarkable day in reporting world. And one thing that is just fascinating about what this all means is, one, he is restricted in what he can do right now, but you can tell that he is champing at the bit to try to get back out, saying that he's going to go to the debate. I don't know if the health advisors are going to let that happen, but he's saying he's going to the debate. There's word that there may be a national address today, or that he will address the nation somehow. And in terms of his approach to the coronavirus, he has taken his own illness and weaved it into the narrative that he was already telling about how we're around the corner, we're around the bend, everything's going to be fine. Perhaps he's lucky, perhaps he's not lucky, perhaps he has the best medical care in the world, but he has been able to fully integrate his experience into the story they've been trying to tell all along.
That's been the interesting thing. Watching on Fox News, some of the pundits are suggesting this is actually a strength, that he can now say he has had this experience. Jenny, you wrote that the president's illness is yet another dividing line in the Trump era. What do you mean by that? Where's this going to go in terms of, his supporters and the undecideds and folks who are with Biden?
I think it for sure depends on what happens, right? We're at I'm losing track of my days. I think we're at day 5 of the president's diagnosis.
Oh, it depends on when his last negative test was, which they won't tell us.
You don't know, right?
Good point. Very good reminder. So I really do think it depends on what happens next, which we of course have no way of knowing. But I think the immediate effect is exactly what we're describing, which people are just shoved further into or entrench themselves further into the corner. Again, I was talking to people as this news is coming out, and their feeling was like, well, we're going to pray for him and he's going to be strong and he's a strong man and he's going to come out of this stronger than ever. There's really a not insignificant number of people who believe that. Now, the polls show us that that's a minority of people, but it's a very significant minority of people. And I think I think there is a chance that he can successfully sell this as a strength rather than a weakness. And also, I'm very curious, there were a lot of people on the left saying, as this news was breaking, like, is this a hoax, right? We've heard from the right all along that COVID is a hoax. And now you have the left wondering, well, is the president doing this just to bolster himself? And I wonder if those voices become louder.
Yeah, and Perry, we've seen this issue, as Tamara noted, of transparency, the doctors not giving the full report. We've also seen these dramatic events, the balcony appearance last night at the White House. How do you think that is going to play with voters and undecided voters? And bringing the COVID issue front and center again to the race. What does that do to Trump and Biden?
I think it will make very little difference electorally. So I tend to think that, I think there was a CNN poll out today showing Trump down by 15 or 16. What you usually see when you have these sort of outlier polls is we all pay attention more to the outlier polls and the other polls that come out the same day that are more normal. And the second is what you tend to see in those polls is really people who maybe worked for Trump last week are saying they're undecided now. So my guess would be we're going to have one, two, or three more debates in which people who are Republicans will be reminded why they're Republicans. They don't like Kamala Harris. They like Amy Barrett, et cetera. So I tend to think this event will not have much electoral effect the way I would argue almost every event has very little electoral effect. I do think what I mentioned seeing is, does it have an effect on how Americans see the virus? And what I mean by that is we have some evidence. I mean, the question is mainly like three groups, I would say. First of all, the polls suggest that Republicans do wear masks, for example. They wear them at lower levels than Democrats do, but they still wear them. So I do wonder, even you may not be able to poll this easily, but I do worry the president was in the hospital because of COVID on Saturday and Sunday. We don't know how severe it was. We know he was in the hospital. People may not say, particularly people who like Trump, may not say, this made me take COVID more seriously. They may not tell a pollster that. But I wonder if we actually learn later on that this was sort of a moment in which people began to take this more seriously in some ways. And I wonder if you're a Democratic governor in a state that you've been trying to keep these mask mandates, my guess is and I've seen this, like Newsom, I live in Kentucky, Andy Beshear, governors are now saying, hey, here's another reason why even the president got this, is something you want to say. And with Republican elected officials who've been generally pushing to open more things up, again, Brian Kemp is not going to say, never mind, I was wrong, I'm an idiot. But I do think the question is like, do they sort of soften the language about everything should open tomorrow? And I think we won't know that soon, but that's something to watch for as well.
I mean, and Priya, from a California perspective, I mean, Gavin Newsom today even tweeted, look, when you go out, be careful when you remove your mask. He got criticized on Twitter by some Republicans for saying that. I mean, do you think in light of the president's illness and the fact that he is suggesting, we shouldn't be afraid of COVID, is Kamala Harris going to be able to continue to push that line about protect yourself, or are they getting some pushback as Newsom did today on Twitter?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, the president is out of the hospital. He seems to be recovering. He seems to be doing all right. Again, if this story had taken a different turn, I think there would have been a lot of satisfied Schadenfreude on the part of many Democrats in California and across the nation. But that's not what happened. And so it doesn't strengthen a message on wearing masks for Democrats in any way, for Newsom or for Kamala. And, this is the Teflon president. Lately, I started to think about him as the slip and slide president more than just Teflon. I mean, it just all goes, right? Whether we're talking about his lack of amount of money that he paid in taxes, if we're talking about his visit to California, where he denies climate change is causing worse fires in California, if we're talking about the Atlantic article in which he was quoted as calling military members losers. None of it seems to make any sort of difference. I think if he had physically gotten worse, or if we see that in the coming weeks, then the story may shift and people may start taking mask wearing more seriously across all parties. But until that happens, I don't see any change.
Yeah, I want to go to, in fact, how this is going to play into an event, the big event tomorrow night. I mean, one week ago today, we were talking about what was widely criticized as this dumpster fire debate. What is going to be the strategy for Kamala Harris and Mike Pence tomorrow night? Let me start with you, Tamara, on that one, in terms of how are they going to address what happened to the president, and what do they need to do? What's job one for both of these candidates going into the debate tomorrow?
Well, I mean, we already know that the stage is going to look different. There will be more social distance. There will be plexiglass, I think, even. there will be a change. And the other thing, though, is that Vice President Pence has tended to take this thing more seriously than the president. I mean, he is the head of the coronavirus task force. He has, policy to talk about in this debate. The thing I'm watching for, that I always watch for with Pence, is how he does his dance. He's pretty much perfected the Trump two-step, where he says that the president is a great guy with broad shoulders. And then he often quotes the president as saying something that he wishes the president had said, or that he wishes the president had said in a way that was more traditional. So it's, in a way, he's like a Trump translator. And he did that in the debate with Tim Kaine 4 years ago. As someone who has covered him, I have never seen him off message. So if you want to know what the message should be, what they want the message to be in the platonic ideal where someone never goes off message, then that's what Pence will say. And in terms of Harris, I think that Priya may have better ideas about what to expect from Harris's strategy.
Priya, I want to get you the Kamala style 1 second, but Jenny, just ask you quickly: is Pence going to go right to a question that Republicans have been asking since that last debate? Is he going to press Biden on, Kamala on packing the Supreme Court, on the filibuster, on adding Puerto Rico and DC as states? Is that a place where we can expect maybe him to go?
Yeah, I think as Tamara just alluded to, that is the message that Republicans sort of want to have. And it seems very clear that that's where he will try to go and sort of try to box Harris into a corner. The strategy has been all along to portray Biden and Harris as these far left liberals. And so any attempt to do that, they're going to try. I found it interesting, as Tamara was talking about Pence being on message, I find, and Priya maybe will disagree, I find Senator Harris to be a relentlessly on message politician, and not necessarily reflective or, going to say something off the cuff. And so I think watching that unfold as they both try to knock each other off balance tomorrow will be really interesting. The one hope I have is that it's going to be more substance than our last debate. It would be hard not to be. Exactly.
Yeah, Priya, what about that? Yeah, you've watched
Senator
Harris. What about
since she was, district attorney here in San Francisco. Look, this is district attorney, attorney general, junior senator here in California. She is so seasoned. She knows what she's doing. This is going to be a performance, right? And they are preparing for that on both sides. I agree, Jenny. I don't think it's going to go off the rails like it did last week. And I'm hoping that it will be more substantive. But I think that that's because they're both coming with a force of argument of their content and not just their personalities, right? But Kamala is a very feisty, aggressive debater. And we've seen that over time. We saw that through the presidential primary. So I think we'll see that again. I think she will absolutely be on the attack, not on the defensive. And she, I think, for the most part, is going to go after President Trump. On the other hand, I think that Pence would go after Kamala as well as Joe Biden, because Senator Harris is seen as a liability in some ways for the Democratic ticket, and that the conservatives see her as a shadow candidate. They think she's really the one behind the power. So I see Pence really going after her personally, as well as President Trump. I don't know that I see that so much on the opposite side. I don't think Kamala is going to, dig into Vice President Pence all that much. I think her message will be fully focused on President Trump. But both of these candidates, they have to show that they're ready to lead, because we see they're a heartbeat away from being leaders themselves. This is going to be the biggest audience that Senator Harris has ever had. So it's going to be really interesting from a California perspective to see this homegrown success story, whether you agree with her or not. And I've got friends on both sides of that aisle. Right. But she is a homegrown success story, and it'll be interesting to see her there.
But Perry, will it change anybody's minds? You talked about this. Did the first debate, even with the big controversy about Trump refusing to sort of condemn outright white supremacists, Did it change any minds? Will VP debate change any minds?
I think it's important for Pence tomorrow because, like I said, I think the poll suggests some number of Republicans are saying they're undecided right now. And Pence needs to sort of say Kamala's a socialist and she's going to take advice from Bernie Sanders and so on to sort of get those people back. So I think that's important. I also think this Supreme Court question is really important on the substance of it. There's a reason Biden ducked the question, which is that a 6-3 Supreme Court with Barrett and Gorsuch on it that strikes down the ACA, strikes down Roe v. Wade, and strikes down the Voting Rights Act is something the Democrats will actually be interested in, like adjusting in some way or packing or whatever the term is. So there's a reason Biden was vague about that question. And watching Harris last year, she was not particularly great in those debates on these kind of, it's going to be hard to sort of commit to not answering that kind of question. And that's going to be hard to do. If their strategy is to continue to non-answer that question, I'm not sure that's going to work. And I think a good moderator will force an actual answer. Yeah,
I mean, interesting point there. And that goes to sort of Kamala's role in the upcoming Supreme Court nomination. Some of the stories out there have suggested she may be the savior for the Democrats, owing to her performance in the Kavanaugh hearings and her questioning of Attorney General Barr in the past. Jenny, your thoughts on that? And I'd like to hear some others. I mean, how much of a role is she going to take in that SCOTUS nomination? I want to get into a little bit of that and the strategy for Democrats as well.
I think it's unquestionable that she will take some sort of starring role just by dint of her personality. I mean, she really has embraced that role and been celebrated for that role. I mean, part of why she was picked as the running mate is for some of the things that she said. And again, kind of the performance aspect that she had in the Kavanaugh hearings. So I think there's no reason to think that she won't play a similar role here. At the same time, it is this question of like, is she boxed in? And how does she try to avoid that? And we've seen already, we didn't talk in the context of the debate about the issue of gender and race, but I expect that will come up a lot during a confirmation hearing and any role she plays in it, either directly or indirectly, either in whispers or shouts or some combination thereof. And sort of how she handles that, I think, will be really important and interesting to watch.
And Tamara, on the Supreme Court hearings coming up, you actually gave Trump the news that RBG had passed away. Am I correct on that? Can you just give us a little insight on what happened there, and what do you expect that the hearings are who the hearings are going to energize coming up? Women, voters, evangelicals. Give me your thoughts.
Yeah. So I don't know for sure that I am the one who told President Trump that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had died. I do know for sure that he acted very surprised and said it was the first he was hearing of it when I told him. So let me lay out the scenario here. It was like my second trip out on Air Force One since March, and we flew into Minnesota for a rally. You hop off the plane, you run to the press area, our little protective pin, and President Trump is up on stage. By the time we get in our spot, he's talking. I'm preparing for what I'm going to talk about Saturday morning on Weekend Edition. And then my editor slacks, RBG is dead. And I'm like, what? So of course I stopped paying attention to the speech, which lasted like an hour and 45 minutes. And President Trump, as part of his stump speech, has a thing where he talks about, like, I've got so many judges. I got 205 million judges because Obama didn't want to do the judges. It's got a lot of mischaracterizations in it. But for whatever reason, he came back to that a few times. And every time he came back to it, it was clear he did not know that RBG was dead. And he was just sort of doing his riff, then must have gotten off track on the teleprompter and got back to it. And by the last time he came back to it, somebody in the crowd yelled, "And you've got one more." I saw no apparent reaction from the president. So as the speech is ending, the White House wranglers, actually the speech wasn't ending yet. It was early. The White House wranglers grabbed us and pulled us to go wait for the president under the wing of Air Force One. And so he finishes the speech. He YMCA is playing because the Rolling Stones have given him a cease and desist. So YMCA is playing, and he shakes hands, gets off stage. He walks with Dan Scavino and Hope Hicks towards us, towards Air Force One. Then they peel off. He walks up to us. Tiny Dancer starts playing, and I shout, "Mr. President, Ruth Bader Ginsburg has died. What is your reaction?" And his reaction was surprise. So I don't know if I told him or not, but there you go.
Sounds like you did tell him. Perry, who does that energize? First of all, I believe the polls show that most Americans don't think Republicans should rush this confirmation, correct? Who is it going to energize if they do? And are they walking a fine line if they try to appear to be rushing it during a COVID pandemic in which a couple of the senators may be coming off quarantine?
So the polls show that most people think they shouldn't seat the Barrett, but the polls show that it's about 40 versus 55. In other words, it's just another version of, do you approve of Trump? Like I could ask a lot of questions that get the same 40, 55 questions. So it's not telling me anything except that you don't like Trump. Here's another manifestation of that. So I guess I think it is motivating more for the Democrats in this case than the Republicans, but I think it's an issue where people on the partisans on both sides care about this issue a lot. But I don't think it matters, honestly. If you told Mitch McConnell it polled 15 to 85, he'd be like, yes, sir, we're going forward. This is like on some level just as important as the election. Having a 6-3 majority that can basically veto any proposal from the state of California, the state of New Jersey, the state of New York, and the Democratic Congress is just so important. You would now basically have, I would put Barrett, Thomas, and Scalia in a group who will basically, my guess is, approve any Republican idea on any issue. And so I think they're going to push this forward. It's going to be unpopular. It's going to be divisive. Harris and Democrats are going to say Barrett might strike down the ACA and Obamacare and so on. And the hearing will make the Republicans look bad. They will be brought back to their quotes about how you said you wouldn't fill a seat in the last year and you did. They do not care. This is too important.
Yeah, they're fascinating. And Priya, on a California angle, sort of, a couple of outlets, including Politico, have written stories about Dianne Feinstein's role in this nomination process, that she's the lead Democrat on Senate Judiciary, and that maybe her age suggests that there are questions about how well she's going to handle that. It's still a lively conversation in California. Is that something we're getting buzz about here in California with regard to Feinstein's role and whether she's going to be able to make the mark?
I think Feinstein's age has come up time and time again, right, Carla, over the years. This is not the first time, and this is not the first time that she's been able to bat that back and say everything's going to be fine. We're all very, very aware of age right now with RBG's passing, with the president and Joe Biden's age. So I'd say just that Feinstein has come up against this before. It's not the first time. And I think, generally people want to see her in there fighting. So I don't think that that's going to be an impact.
Yeah, and she's been very active on Twitter and with press releases since some of those stories came out. I think the SCOTUS nomination sort of also puts front and center how this COVID pandemic and Trump's handling of it still remains the number one issue. And Perry, I just wanted to quickly get to you. You recently told the New York Post that the coronavirus outbreak and the massive surge in unemployment, this goes to the economic issue, has moved the American political discourse to the left. How so do you think? How do you think the unemployment situation and the economy plays in, and what are we going to see there?
So I think I wrote a piece in June basically saying a lot of the ideas that like if you had told me we're going to send a check to every American for $1,200, maybe 2 years ago, I would have said, in what are we talking about, another country? I would not have immediately thought that was a plausible idea in the US. If you had told me Joe Biden, who ran as the moderate candidate, would be talking about FDR and the Great Depression and so on. So I think that, and like, by the way, Mitt Romney supported sending the check to people too. So it wasn't just the, so I think more populist ideas and more liberal ideas are more popular in terms of how people are seeing COVID. I would say that piece was written in June that I wrote. I think the New York Post quoted something I had written. I'm not as confident. I think I have been, I'll be honest, like, I think Pelosi in March or April said, we don't need state aid. I don't want to make, we don't need state aid. Essentially, she said, we'll pass that in the next COVID bill. I think I, like her, thought there would be another COVID bill, and we both analyzed it incorrectly. Is it like the Republican opposition to giving more money to people who are out of work was a little like, I thought the unemployment benefits would be extended longer. I think the Republican opposition, the sort of Republican small government views have come back to sort of a more normal place. But I do think if Joe Biden wins, this will be a more liberal administration than I would have guessed when he was running in the primary.
Yeah. Let me just remind folks out there, you can send your questions to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. We're going to get to them real fast. Jenny, let me ask you, because you've been out there on the campaign trail in Arizona, in Nevada, other places, on the issue of the economy, job loss, 22 million jobs lost. How is that still, playing with people? What were you hearing from voters out there in terms of how much that issue oversees everything with regard to this election?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the two basic questions I keep asking any voter I come into contact with is, do you know anybody who's gotten sick? And do you know anybody who's lost their job or had some sort of job, hourly wage loss, significant job loss? And the answer to the first question is often no. And the answer to the second question is almost always yes. So I think a lot of people know either they themselves or know people who are suffering job loss, some sort of real economic instability. And that was Trump's, and still is, frankly, Trump's one calling card. The polls keep showing that is where he is viewed as doing better than Biden, or perhaps a better steward of the economy than Biden. And so there's a real disconnect for a lot of people. Again, I'm kind of repeating the same thing I said earlier, but so much of this is seen from a partisan lens. I talked to one man on Friday who had lost his job in May, but is a Republican and doesn't blame it on Trump at all. And on the other hand, if you talk to Democrats, they really see this as being, Trump's fault. And the other way that this comes into conflict, which isn't about job loss, but is still about the economy, is schools, right? So many people have to deal with childcare in their homes while if they are still lucky enough to have a job that they can be done at home, they're still dealing with childcare. And again, I think that is just sort of at the forefront of anybody's mind, even if they don't know a single person who's gotten COVID themselves.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and Tamara from Capitol Hill, Perry referenced the inability of Congress to get through any kind of second wave of help here. How much is that going to matter to voters? And how much is that going to affect some of these folks at the ballot box? Are they sweating it here?
Yeah, my colleague Mara Eliason said something like, this is the single greatest failure of Congress, at least in a while. You have a situation where there are still millions of people out of work and their unemployment has run out. You have, every time I leave my house, which is not as often as it used to be, you see new businesses boarded up. Like, this is very real, and it's very real in people's lives. And there's a major disconnect with Congress. In some ways, it's not clear how this election is going to go, but it seems as goes the president, so goes many of these competitive Senate races. And so, it's unlikely that many of these Senate candidates are going to vastly outperform the president from their party. And as I've been out, I was in Ohio talking to some voters. There is like a real sort of pox on all their houses feeling where, I was talking to this one guy and I was like, well, what about Rob Portman? No, and not all these people are on the ballot, but I was just like naming every politician in the great state of Ohio. And it was just like, nope. They all suck.
Yeah.
And I think there is just like a great frustration that there is a failure of leadership. And it's, one thing that's been fascinating to me is that, the Republican ads don't have Joe Biden in them. Like, beware of this boogeyman. It's not Joe Biden. It's Nancy Pelosi, and she's kind of so last cycle. But it's also the squad. It's Kamala Harris. It's like you're more likely to see Bernie Sanders in a Republican ad than you are to see Joe Biden.
That is absolutely fascinating. We got a couple of minutes to audience questions. But I want to get to one thing about Trump in California, Priya. The issue of climate change, obviously the wildfires, which are raging as we speak, are such a huge issue. And Gavin Newsom has been out there. The president came here about, it seems like a long time ago. It was about a week ago.
September, a couple weeks.
Yeah,
it was another month.
Yeah,
That's right.
I'm just wondering, he's still in Sacramento, talked about how it's about forest management. We can just talk a little bit about, we know where he's at in California, but does this issue of climate change, you think, and particularly the way he has approached it in California, does that have a national, impact in terms of how voters are going to see this race elsewhere in the country?
It's interesting. On KQED Newsroom, we just had on a professor out of East Coast University, who they run a poll every year, and it's been for the last 10 years. And they look at public opinion around climate change. And what's interesting is that as of this year in January, for the first time, more people in America were seeing climate change as human cause and as a really alarming issue. So there is public feeling and public sentiment that climate change is a major issue. However, again, as we've said, I think this has been the theme throughout. Will that translate into votes? I don't know that climate change ranks up there for undecided voters in the way that it does for Democrats, right? To get them to the polls, or for liberals in general. And so I don't think climate change is going to be that issue. Of course, for us here in California, look, we've just had an unprecedented 4 million acres burned. It's an ongoing issue. It'll continue, but California, is already swinging. We know where it's going. It's not swinging. It's stuck. So I don't see it being an issue, obviously, here. I don't actually see it being a national issue, even though these images of fires are on everyone's TVs across the nation.
It's fascinating. Tamara, from the Washington perspective, we in California sort of see this as California centric, but the president has talked about Democrat-run states, sanctuary states. A lot of people have said, is he running against California? He's mentioned California so much when it comes to high taxes, when it comes to opening schools. He and Gavin Newsom seem to have a decent relationship, but is the president in some respects running against, socialists in California, Democrat-run states? Is that part of his strategy?
He hasn't talked about Chardonnay lately, so I would say that, it's an interesting thing. In 2016, when he ran, he was like, look at this American carnage in these terrible cities. I'm going to fix it. And now his response is, look at this American carnage in these terrible cities. It is totally the fault of Democrats. So his approach to it is a little bit different. And obviously, California has become something of the headquarters of the resistance in terms of legal battles, and with the Ninth Circuit constantly giving him headaches. But, he needs a foil. He always needs a foil. And it's been very interesting, though, that he has been largely unwilling to criticize Newsom because he has trouble criticizing anyone who says nice things about him. And Newsom has done a good job of communicating with the president in a way that avoids feuding. Though I will say that with this last trip, Newsom's pushback was stronger than it was 2 years ago. He was much more upfront about, how much of the forest California actually manages, by the way, than he was 2 years before.
Yeah, I agree. We're going to start taking questions now. PPIC event questions at gmail.com. Let me go to Jenny for the first question, because this reminds me of an issue that was all the headlines about a week ago. Do you think the president's COVID-19 diagnosis has taken the issue of his taxes off the table for the rest of the campaign? Of course, the New York Times had that blockbuster investigative piece about the president's taxes. Jenny, what are we going to see more of those stories? By the way, we were promised some more, but where do you think the taxes issue is going to land?
I can't, excuse me, I can't speak for my colleagues' great reporting, but I trust the promise, the billboard that there will be more, that there probably will be more. Do I think it takes it off the table? I guess the question is for who, right? I don't think it takes it off the table for the press. I don't think it takes it off the table for Biden. I suspect that that will be something that the Democrats continue to go after him. But again, we keep going back to the same question of, is it effective? And I don't think we've seen any evidence, frankly, that it is convincing, that it is pulling support away from Trump to Biden. I just don't see that that has happened. And so I don't know how that plays. To me, one of the most salient things that got picked up is this question of how much should he pay? The figure 750 got a lot of buzz, but does buzz translate into normal people's votes? I honestly don't know the answer. And I think anybody who tells you they do is not being honest.
Perry, you think that resonates with just average working voters out there? The idea the president has only paid $750 in taxes for the last couple of years?
I mean, it's a memorable thing. I think part of the question underlying a lot of these topics is we don't know what undecided voters decide based on, because undecided voters are, to put it bluntly, weirdos, right? Like most people sort of know who they're voting for, particularly with a Donald Trump style president. So we're talking about 5% of people. We know they generally don't follow the news very much. That's something common in studies of them. We know they're not particularly partisanly aligned. So I don't know. So it's hard for me to sort of get down and say this issue will ship undecided people, because I actually don't know. And in some cases, they don't know themselves. And so, and they're not, and undecided voters are not sort of like Michael Bloomberg. They're like liberal on some issues, but sort of the other, you find they have a wide range of views that are very unpredictable. So in that sense, but I would say, I think in some ways, these issues are not, like, let's take the 95% of people who know who they're voting for right now, at least. These issues like taxes, and I would argue the economy, are not the issues. If Donald Trump, you really want to see the electorate shift, have Donald Trump put on a Black Lives Matter t-shirt and wear it for 2 days. Then I think you'll see some shifts in the, so I think it's worth thinking about. It's not just that we have partisanship, it's like partisanship around these identity issues that we're really talking about here. It's like we have sort of that's kind of what's driving all this. And that's why if we got to, if Joe Biden said something about, evangelicals, it was very negative, or like, that's the kind of thing where I think a lot of the partisanship really is about these race and identity issues. And that's kind of why people are not changing, because the parties are very sorted on those issues specifically. And that's kind of, and it's hard to sort of move those kind of fundamentals very much.
Yeah,
one thing that I am watching for too, I mean, undecided voters, we pay a lot of attention to them, probably because they are unicorns and we're like, ooh, a unicorn. But the other thing is, some people are not deciding between voting for Joe Biden and voting for Donald Trump. They are deciding between voting for one of them and voting for no one, or Mickey Mouse.
Yeah.
And so at this point, some of these things can affect enthusiasm. They could, make a voter be like, I don't know, it's just not worth it. Or it could really motivate a voter. And so I think, energy, enthusiasm. Obviously, though, we also have highly motivated Democrats and highly motivated Republicans, and they're just as polarized about their motivation as they are as about everything else. But there are, I think, a larger subset of people who are just kind of not that excited.
Yeah, I mean, and Jenny, you've written about this in terms of Latino voters. I mean, for years, they've been called the sleeping giant in key states like Arizona and Nevada, where you've done reporting, particularly younger Latinos. Are they going to turn out based on issues like family separation, the wall, etc.?
I think to Perry's point, there's just a lot of reasons that people are turning out. And I think among young people in particular, and guess it depends on what your definition of young is. But when I'm saying young, I sort of mean anybody under the age of, say, 40. There is just a lot of both excitement and at the same time just utter frustration. But a lot of people are using that frustration to either convince their friends or to be convinced themselves to use it at the polls. I mean, Tamara just hit on this, but I will be watching very closely, like, what is the turnout like and who is that turnout for? There is a bit of like, on the one, it's almost the inverse of enthusiasm. It's enthusiasm to vote Trump out, not to vote Biden in, but that enthusiasm is quite strong among many of the young Latino voters that I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, and Perry, what about some of the other key electorates that we've heard about? Some of the folks want to know about that. Trump has talked about he's been the best president for African Americans since Lincoln. We know that African American women are reliable voters, and there's been a lot of talk about him wanting to peel off African American men. How's that looking to you?
Not particularly persuasive. So he's polling a little better with Black men, as men are more Republican, and that's across races. So he's polling at like 12, 14% among Black men. He's polling at sort of like around 0 to 4% among Black women. That's sort of what was happening in 2016. Not a big shift there. I do think, as much as we talk about, or as much as I and other people talk about sort of the quote unquote browning of the electorate, in reality, like what I think it'll be 74% of the voters will be non-Hispanic white voters. When you go to a state like Wisconsin, that's almost Iowa, that's almost the entire electorate. What we're really seeing in this election is interesting is that race is polarizing, but it's racial views and the difference between white people and other white people on racial issues, really white college grads and non-white. So the election is more racialized than ever before, but not in the sort of like, not really with a focus on minorities. Like if Joe Biden wins, what's going to happen is a lot of like he's going to win with white women shifting toward him more than in 16, white college grads shifting to him more than in 16, and sort of white people who live in the suburbs around Phoenix, around Atlanta, around Philadelphia. The election is about race, but not about minorities really. It's about like, these protests were sort of the biggest event of the election, I would argue. And the fact that Donald Trump was on one side of them and Joe Biden was on the other, that's kind of, and that you saw the conventions were about, the Republican convention was about defend the police. The DNC was about sort of like, look how inclusive we are. And that's kind of, but the audience was white people, really more than minorities.
Yeah.
Let me just add one piece to this that I've been paying attention to. So in specific, not just the racial discussion, but women in general, right? And where they're going to vote. And when you look at the unemployment numbers recently, it is largely impacting women. 3 times more women are deciding to stay home or are losing their jobs because of COVID than men. And so I'm really curious about how that will impact the vote. And if we're going to see an economic message actually resonate with some of these either undecided or more conservative voters who may be feeling the impacts of this unemployment when it comes time to vote.
I think the childcare issue goes right to what you're talking about there.
That's right.
For so many women. We got another audience question I want to get in because we're running out of time. Given the hard-boiled nature of voter polarization, what, if anything, can break the partisan ideological stranglehold? Is the Kool-Aid too strong? I guess the question is there any chance that people are going to cross the line or change votes in the last? Are they going to be persuadable? Jenny, your thoughts first, and then whoever wants to get in on this.
I don't know the answer. I am both a part of me feels very cynical about that right now, and part of me wonders, how can we not? I think I alluded to this earlier, even more worrisome than the ideological stranglehold on partisanship is the stranglehold on what truth is and reality is. And I don't know how we build back from that. And that is a job not just of the president, but of the media as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. A couple questions. Several people want to know, how is the presidential race affecting the battle for the control of the Senate? Tamara, have any thoughts on who's really sweating it?
Well, I mean, I think that the Amy Coney Barrett confirmation, and whether it happens before or after the election, could have a real impact on someone like Susan Collins in Maine, who is doing her best to really like express concern about the process and sort of really walk a narrow line, but it's going to be really hard to walk that narrow line if she has to take a vote. I think that could play. I also just think that like someone like Cory Gardner is not going to outperform Donald Trump by 20 points. It's just unlikely to happen. So if President Trump is tanking in some of these states, it's going to be a problem.
Lindsey Graham. What about Lindsey Graham?
I would love everybody else's thoughts on that. I can't figure out. I mean, I think he's going to have this hero moment with the Amy Coney Barrett confirmation, and I think that will help fix the problems that he's having right now. But I'm not sure.
Yeah,
in 2016, something very unusual happened, which is in every Senate race, the party that won the presidential contest also won the Senate race. So like that alignment is getting stronger and stronger. So that means that the Democrats' best chances are probably, let's say, Maine, Colorado, North Carolina, Arizona. Those are places where it looks like Biden has a comfortable lead right now. It's hard for me to see. So the polls right now show Harrison and Graham really close, and that's interesting. I would still bet on Graham, if only because Trump seems likely to win that state. And if you've ever seen Jamie Harrison and talked to him, the Trump-Harrison voter is somebody I'm not easily imagining exists in real life. So I think that's part of it. Like if you're in Kentucky, Trump is winning by so much that Amy McGrath somehow winning over McConnell seems implausible. So I think as long as Biden has this 7% lead nationally, it's hard to see much breakthrough in how the Senate race will be much different from that. I would say in terms of the sort of, we're not totally stuck. We're saying we said a lot of times there is polarization that's really strong. We are looking at, there's still a certain amount of people that have shifted over the last 4 years. And the evidence I have for that is like, I think Clinton lost Iowa by 10%. Biden is tied there. I think Clinton lost Ohio by 7 points. Biden is tied there. The Democratic nominee for president is spending money, millions of dollars in Texas and Georgia. Like if he wins Texas and Georgia, that would be earth shattering. So that would suggest, even though there's a small number of people who have shifted, those numbers might be decisive. And I think even though there's only 5% of undecideds left, probably that's really important because that'll decide, like if the Democratic candidate wins Texas, we are in a new moment of American politics. And I think that is certainly on the table right now.
And I think that brings us to maybe our last question. I'm hearing and I'm seeing from audience questions, a real nervousness about how this election is going to turn out and what happens after the election. There's a lot of concern. Any of your thoughts on whether you think, are we going to be in real trouble if this election is not a landslide election? What happens? I'll start with you, Tamara. We've got about a minute left, so just to give us a...
Yeah, I'll make it fast. The Trump legal team has built an army of lawyers, both volunteer lawyers that are going to SWAT team into states, and also, if you look at it right now, there is active litigation in something like 36 states or something. There is active litigation all over the country about the voting process. If it's close, then it's going to be a challenging month of, misinformation flying wildly and who the heck knows. But it may not be close.
Yeah, Perry, any thoughts on that? Are we going to be in trouble here in terms of unrest? People are worried about this.
I'm worried about it too. Like if we have a close election, I assume the Trump team will litigate it a lot. We have a person in Trump who I don't know what situation he would concede in, but I think it's hard to imagine what that is. Will he ever concede? That's a real question out there. Will he encourage his supporters? And we've already seen some evidence that he's sort of encouraging people to go to the polls and be poll watchers. And you can be a poll watcher in a polite way. I don't think he's signaling that's what he's looking for. So I'm worried about election day itself. I'm worried there's a lot of fighting about whose ballots is counted. And I'm of the view we should try to count people's ballots as much as possible. That's not the view of Trump's legal team right now. So I do think if the election is not a blowout, then we're going to have a lot of contestation about it. And we may not, and it may be, I think of it as like election month, not election, or in fact, we should think about it almost as voting has started, so we're having election month before the election, and it may be another month of counting, which the media, I would argue, should be very prepared for. If Trump says, "I won," we should not let Facebook and Twitter just send it everywhere first. We should be very vigorous in saying, well, we don't know who won yet.
Right.
And don't forget that the Supreme Court may come into play, obviously, as well, like it did with Bush and Kerry, right?
Yes.
So that's the next piece that we need to keep thinking about. Yeah.
Right.
And Trump has already pointed to his willingness to play that game.
Right. Another issue we got to worry about, and unfortunately we are out of time already. And fascinating discussion. I really want to thank all of our panelists for participating. This has just been, I could go on forever, but PPIC would also like to thank the sponsors of this event. And finally, thank you to all of you who joined us online today for caring about the election. If you pre-registered for this event, later today, you'll get a survey. I know PPIC would appreciate your feedback. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, panelists, and please be safe.